For today's webinar, we're going to be going over how to connect your accounting software with Ramp, as well as a few additional topics. In the Accounting tab, we're going to press Get Started Now. For today's conversation, I'll be connecting via QuickBooks Online. However, Ramp does have a number of direct accounting provider integrations, including Xero, NetSuite, Sage Intacct, Microsoft, Acumatica, Zoho, as well as some additional integrations that are actually built out by the ERP specifically, such as Puzzle. If you do not see your accounting provider here, use this drop-down list and note that this will be an indirect connection. If you are on an indirect connection, you'll be connecting via a process we call Universal CSV. As I said today, we're going to be connecting via QuickBooks Online. If that's also your accounting provider, then you're in luck. The first thing it's going to prompt you to do is to indicate that we want to connect to QuickBooks Online. Note that you'll need a QBO admin to connect. We'll want to press Connect, indicating that we give Ramp permission. This process should take under 60 seconds. The first thing it's prompting us to do here is to create a Ramp card liability account. Now, as a CSM, this is always best practice that I share with my customers to actually map our Ramp transactions into a liability account specific for Ramp in your accounting provider. This will make the reconciliation process at month end much more efficient. You could always use an existing liability account, but it is recommended to create a new one. Since I already have one for Ramp card, I'm going to use that, but you'll likely be selecting this Create a New Liability Account. Naming it like Ramp, something like Ramp card will suffice. If you're not on QuickBooks Online, I would do this as well. Just note to make it a liability account, credit card type if possible. Once you've created that or indicated what account we want to sync transactions to, press this Continue button. Once we've done that, you should see your transaction history begin to pull through. Now, this Accounting tab looks very similarly to the Expenses tab. However, there are a few notable differences. One of the most notable differences is that the Expenses tab has pending transactions. In the Accounting tab, this will only be cleared transactions. And that's because we don't want to sync a transaction that hasn't actually cleared to our accounting software. So if you do not see transactions that you're looking for, they've likely not cleared and they'll be in that Expenses tab. The other call out that I'll make about this Accounting tab is that once we code and sync these transactions to QuickBooks Online or your accounting provider, this tab will be cleared out. Ideally, by month-end close, this tab will be cleared out, meaning that all those transactions have the proper coding, approvals, receipts, memos, and have been accounted for in our accounting software. Before we do any kind of syncing, we'll need to set up some sync settings configurations. If you guys will meet me again in the Accounting tab and Settings on the top right-hand corner. These are the accounting settings. The first thing we're going to configure is our sync settings. This is key before we sync to QBO or our provider. The first account we'll need to set up is that liability account. Now, we've already done this, but if you haven't yet, take a few seconds to select the correct liability account we'll be syncing transactions into. The next account we'll need to delegate is the statement payment account. This indicates what account we'll be paying Ramp statements out of every month. In my demo account, I'm connected to the account 9752 for Ramp statement payments. I'll just need to tell the platform what this checking account is called within my chart of accounts. Again, this is to make reconciliation more effective. The third account we'll need to delegate is a QuickBooks cash back account. Now, this is going to be if you are eligible for the Ramp cashback. I usually recommend as a CSM to map it to something like other income, miscellaneous income, or uncategorized income. In my account, I have other income, so I'll be using that. There's no need to create one specifically for cashback or for ramp cashback, but if you do prefer that, feel free to create one. Once you've delegated a liability account, a cash account, and a cashback account, we'll be able to save those changes on the bottom. If needed, we could always change the accounting date from transaction to clearing date, or tell the platform that we prefer receipts not to get synced to our accounting provider. Additionally, since we're in here, let's also mention briefly reimbursements and bill pay, since those are available on Ramp as well. If you'll be doing reimbursements and bill pay, highly recommend to set up these sync settings as well. The first one will be for reimbursements, and we'll need an AP and a bank account. And bill pay will also need an AP and a bank account as well. Since card spend is top of mind, let's just ensure those changes are saved and click out of that. Now that we've configured our sync settings, we can go into coding and syncing. Now there's a few ways to do this. The first thing I will show you is how to code a transaction on the fly. You'll notice all of my transactions are in this Needs Review tab. That means that they need to be reviewed prior to syncing to QBO, whether that be approval, reviewing receipts and memos, or coding. Let's go with this Uber transaction since it's the first one. I might not want to sync this since it looks like it hasn't been approved yet, but for our purposes, I will be syncing. If you are doing approvals on transactions, you'll see a small green person icon here, indicating that that has been approved. This ALOF transaction, for example, has not been approved because it's waiting for necessary information from the cardholder before a manager or an admin can approve it. If you're not doing approvals, you'll see a badge icon, which indicates auto approve. Going back to that Uber transaction, we can see the transaction information clearly laid out. It looks like a receipt is not required. Maybe I'll add a memo, which will get synced over to our accounting provider. Maybe this is a ride to dinner for client. Let's go ahead and save that memo, and that will get synced to QuickBooks Online. Next, we're going to look at that QBO category. For Uber, we can either scroll or type. Now this is going to be coded to our travel general ledger account. I'm going to create a rule to actually automate this in the future. There's a few different ways to create rules, including merchant, category, card, location, and department. In Ramp, automation rules are one of the many ways that we will save you time and money. I feel like for Uber, I'm going to create a merchant rule because I know that anytime my company spends on Uber, it will be coded to travel. Alternatively, we could create a category rule, bucketing all taxi and rideshare transactions to the category of travel. Category rule is the most broad rule that we have on Ramp, meaning that any other rule will basically override a category rule. The most specific rule that we have on Ramp is a card rule, meaning that that card should always be coded to a specific general ledger account or field in your accounting software. I'm going to create this Uber rule here and automatically code 44 transactions. A few other ways to code transactions are to use bulk and search functionalities. Maybe we wanted to look up the category of restaurants. We could use the search functionality to find all of our transactions affiliated with the category of restaurants. It looks like I've got 85 transactions. I can code up to 50 of those at the same time. Let's code those to meals and entertainment. That definitely saved me a lot of time, so I will not have to individually code those. Since these transactions are now ready to move to QuickBooks Online, I can indicate this by either selecting in bulk or one by one that these are ready to sync. Now we can see that transaction has moved from the Needs Review tab to the Ready to Sync tab. I'm going to move over the rest of these as well. In just a few clicks of the button, now I have 50 transactions ready to sync to QBO. Let's also move over that Uber one. The next thing we're going to look at is rules within the settings. The first way to create a rule is on the fly based on the transaction, but you can actually create rules proactively in this coding rules area. You can see here I have a few rules set up already, but maybe we can create a few more. The most common rules that I see created are merchant to category and category to category. We created one of these merchant to categories earlier with Uber. I usually, as a CSM, recommend merchant to category rules for frequently purchased at merchants or recurring merchants. So for example, if I spent at Google Ads every single month, I could code that to my advertising general ledger account, meaning that when a Google Ads transaction comes in, I'll never have to code that again. If there is one-off exceptions, you can of course manually change those before you move the transaction over to QBO or your other accounting software, of course. Going into Ramp category to category, we can review these. I mentioned Ramp has categories. These differ from your accounting categories. Ramp categories actually align with Visa's MCC codes. So Visa transactions will tell you if a merchant belongs to an airline category or a fuel and gas category. So for example, we made our transaction at Uber, which affiliates with the taxi and rideshare category. Now we've gone over sync settings for initial configuration, coding rules. Next, let's go into the accounting fields area. Even with coding rules, I'm sure there is still some opportunities where we're going to have to manually code transactions. We noticed that there was a very large drop-down list for our chart of accounts. Instead of scrolling or typing, there's a few tips as a CSM that I like to provide to make the process a bit easier. One of the options is actually hiding some of those accounts to make the drop-down list a bit smaller. If we click on our QuickBooks category, meaning our chart of accounts, we can see the Update Options button here and hide options that we don't need. So for example, if we do not code credit cards to billable expense income or checking account, we can hide those options, making the drop-down list for coding a bit more concise. We can review what transaction accounts are visible or hidden in these areas here. Additionally, if you do have users that will be coding, meaning if you expect your users to add the accounting coding for their transactions, I highly recommend adding a helper text. This will make it a lot more seamless for them, so they'll have a bit more information on what they're expected. I added an expense code here for my users since I want employees to code. Additionally, you can always add a default option. For category, this might not be the best option, but for other accounting fields, default option could work very well. If you are a Ramp Plus user, you can always use Who Sees What to create workflows to show users specific accounting categories based on inputs like department or location. Clicking the back button, let's review what other accounting fields are being synced in from QuickBooks. It looks like there's a handful of accounts and fields that are being synced in from QBO, including my category, vendor, location, class, customer job, and billable. However, for credit card transactions, I do not need billable. So I'm going to select that field and stop syncing it. You can resync a field at any time at the very bottom of the screen. Now, select the back button to take us back to the QBO settings. We reviewed coding rules, accounting fields, and sync settings now. The last thing I'll show you is this danger zone. If for any reason you do need to disconnect from your accounting provider, you can do so here. Just note that if you do disconnect, it might be best to let a RAMP team member know. For example, if you're moving from one accounting provider to another, you'll need to disconnect, and our team members would be happy to help out with that. Additionally, note that if you do disconnect from your accounting provider, any rules like these mapping rules or hidden fields will be removed. So definitely think twice before disconnecting. Only do it if it's important. Let's click out of the settings. An additional area that I'll show you briefly is splitting a transaction. The easiest way to do this is within these three dots here and split transaction. This is highly useful if a transaction needs to be split among multiple departments, for example, and can be split multiple different ways. This coding split will be synced over to your accounting provider. Now that we've reviewed quite a few different things, let's go to the Ready to Sync tab and sync a few transactions. Right now, I only want to sync this Uber transaction, so I'll select one transaction. We can see here, this yellow sync button appears, and we can sync the transaction. It will pull up one more window of review prior to syncing, just to ensure that this transaction is ready to go. Since once we move it over to the accounting software, no changes can be made. You'll have to make those changes in your accounting software. So for example, adding a receipt or changing the coding. Let's sync this to QuickBooks Online. And now you'll see it has been removed from the Ready to Sync tab. As I've said before, the ideal scenario is having this tab cleared out by month-end close, indicating that we have all those transactions accounted for. If we wanted to review our sync settings, we can do so in these three dots at the very top right-hand corner and go to Sync History. This will show us what transactions were synced, when, and by who. Today, I've made 2 syncs to QuickBooks. This is the last transaction that I synced, which was just one transaction. I can also download a CSV if needed for this transaction. Speaking of downloading information, let's go to the Expenses tab and talk about downloading receipts. The Expenses tab is where all of your historical transaction information is going to live. Select the Expenses tab and follow along. If we need to pull reports based on cardholder, department, project, this is a great place to do it. There's pretty robust filtering options. So for example, if we needed to see specific cardholders, transactions, maybe we wanted to look at Gabe's over a specific date range, either a current, previous statement, or even a custom range. Let's go with the past 3 months. It looks like this is 20 transactions. Once I've added my filters, I can pull downloads, CSVs, QBO files, or download a zip file of the receipts. Note that the zip file is going to be bucketed based on the cardholder. So when you do get that zip file, it's going to be one file of every cardholder's receipts separated. Highly recommend that if you do have to save receipts for internal purposes. Now let's clear out of these filters and move on to the next. Now, the last thing I'll show you is how to enable employee coding. I briefly mentioned this previously, but some businesses that I do work with expect their employees to add accounting coding, whether that be for category, department, location, project. We can enable that in Ramp in the expense policy. Follow me to Settings and Expense Policy and Expense Requirements. Now I have a few expense policy requirements here based on my different cards, my different use cases. So let's add some requirements for coding. Let's do it for this admin meal policy. I'll select Edit and add the requirement of QBO category and maybe class, since that's department in my instance. This will indicate that any transaction made on that card greater than or equal to $75 will require a receipt, QuickBooks category, and QuickBooks location. And now we've enabled employee coding. We've connected our accounting software using the example of QuickBooks Online. We've gone over how to code those transactions using things like bulk editing, coding rules, and single select coding. We've gone over settings up initial sync configuration settings. We've gone over syncing transactions, downloading receipts, as well as enabling employee coding.